We are again in South suburban Chicago for this video. The original founders of Harvey saw this city becoming the next great American city to live and work in, but today it's actually one of the worst places you can live in all of Chicagoland. We'll get into all of why that is in this video.
I begin the video driving north along Halsted just south of town. Here you can find an abandoned Walmart store on the west side of Halsted. Walmart closed their Homewood store in February 2023 with very little notice. When reached for comment, the company said that the store wasn't meeting their financial needs. What the company and the mainstream media won't tell you about that is that shoplifting at this Walmart was out of control, and neither Walmart or the media will admit to such because they don't want to be called
racist.
And despite the play on words to sound more politically correct and all, Walmart was still called
racist
anyway by at least one of the regular shoppers here when being interviewed by Fox 32. Despite the Walmart closing, there's still plenty of other stores nearby. It's not like the area has become a ghost town. Right next to the failed Walmart is a Kohl's, and across the street you have a Home Depot, Target, and Menards. South of the failed Walmart is a Best Buy, and there's other smaller stores located throughout the stretch of Halsted just south of 294, so this area isn't necessarily dead, and there's plenty of things to do here. You can even get a European wax if you wanted to. Additionally, there's a new casino in the works called Wind Creek Chicago Southland, which is expected to open in July of 2024, or only a few months after me uploading this video. Anyway, point is that despite the Walmart closing, this area is probably going to be just fine moving forward. It all depends on if the shoplifting can stay under control in this area. Even though this shopping area is in Homewood, I showed it because it's the closest shopping area for most of Harvey's residents, as there's barely anywhere else to shop inside of the city limits, or even outside of it in any other direction. You'll see what I mean throughout this video, and since we're on the subject of crime, Harvey is a city where the violent crime rate is nearly 4 times the national average, and the property crime rate is more than double. Not only is there a high crime rate in Harvey, but the city has extremely high poverty rates, extremely low property values, one of the lowest median household incomes in all of Illinois, fewer adults with bachelor's degrees than almost anywhere else in Chicagoland, including Gary. Everywhere you look, it's depressing, hideous, deserted, desolate, bleak, and you can see what I'm talking about by just driving through Harvey on Halsted. For example, we're looking at an almost fully abandoned office building on one side of the street, while on the other side, you have what appears to be a completely abandoned office building followed by a gas station that looks like it belongs on the set of Breaking Bad. If you've seen my video on Chicago Heights, you can think of Harvey as being Chicago Heights' not-so-identical twin brother. You know, you can tell the difference between the two cities, but they're both really similar in how they've developed and how they have undeveloped over the years. Harvey was once home to as many as 35,800 people back in 1980, but 50 years later, that number had shrunk down to 20,000, and today, it's even lower. The last time that Harvey had fewer than 20,000 people living within its city was in the mid-1940s. That being said, let's share some major occurrences that happened in 1945. In 1945, the USS Indianapolis was sunk by the Japanese. In exchange, the US bombed Hiroshima, in which Japan surrendered on August 14th of that year. Man, those were some dark times, and we think we have it bad now. 1945 is also the year that German concentration camps ceased, and 1945 is the last time that Harvey had fewer than 20,000 residents. On a more local scale, 1945 was the first year of publication for Chicago History magazine. It marks the year when World War II officially came to an end, in which just under 1 million Illinois men and women had served our country in some capacity. Guarantee you that some of them were from Harvey. O'Hare first opened the previous year. Back then it was called Orchard Field. There was also a 4-man delegation from Chicago who traveled to London to put in a bid on Chicago for being the headquarters for the United Nations. Lastly, 1945 is the last time that Harvey had fewer than 20,000 residents. And oh wait, there's even more! No, just kidding, that's it. Well, back in those days, Harvey was a growing city. Today, while looking around, it's difficult to see Harvey ever becoming a growing city again. In fact, the economic stats collectively are among the worst that you'll see for any community in the entire Chicago metro area. The Census Bureau estimates the population of Harvey to be down to 19,000 residents, a 3.5% dip since 2020. The median household income is an extremely low $41,000 per year, and only 10% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher. The median value of a home is $88,000, and the poverty rate is 24.3%. Well, believe it or not, we just saw the nicest part of Halsted as it heads through Harvey. The rest of it looks much worse. Driving down Halsted and looking out the window is like observing earthquake damage in some parts. I mean, talk about ugly, talk about depressing, urban blight, boarded up windows. It's everywhere you look. This area is east of the Metro Line, or what was originally the Illinois Central Railroad. West of the tracks was the original town, with your traditional retail businesses and homes, while plans called for the area east of the tracks to be industrial. But before we see this old and beat-up industrial area, let's talk about what things were like in the glory days. Things were so glorious in Harvey that the place was home to at least 6 pretty cottages, according to an old Harvey Land Association catalog. Back then, one of these pretty cottages only cost $500. In case you were wondering, today it costs $28,000 for an unpretty cottage in Harvey, Illinois. In the late 1800s, however, those pretty cottages were actually pretty cottages because things were quite different in Harvey back then. Once the railroads were built, industry was able to thrive here because not only was it much cheaper to operate in the south suburbs in comparison to Chicago, but the railroads connected Harvey and other south suburbs with the ports along Lake Michigan, so railroads made it to where it wasn't necessary to be located right along the lakeshore anymore. Well, it was 1889 when Turlington Harvey, who was a wealthy Chicago businessman, started to buy up large portions of property in the land that eventually became Harvey. At that time, the settlement was called South Lawn. This is an 1862 map of Cook County, and neither South Lawn or Harvey is labeled on the map. Fast forward 30 years, and here's a map from 1890, which has labels for both South Lawn and Harvey. Really though, this area sprung up quickly throughout the 1880s, and once Turlington Harvey started buying up land in the area, things ended up taking off even quicker. With all of the land that Harvey purchased, he then created the Harvey Land Association. Then he began to promote the area as a place that offered factory jobs and affordable housing for blue-collar workers. With this being the peak era for train travel, it helped that one of the area's major railroads, the Illinois Central Railroad, provided both freight and passenger travel. It was like having a freeway before freeways. Well, it didn't take long before several manufacturers set up operations in the part of town that we're driving around right now. Another thing to point out is how Harvey was a religious man. He wanted the community of Harvey to be a Christian community. He also wanted it to be a dry city, or a city that discouraged alcohol. The pitch in an old 1890 newspaper ad for the town said how Harvey is and always will be a temperance town, and the laboring and businessmen who settle down here will be assured of a peaceful and sober community in which to bring up their children. Safe to say that Harvey didn't turn out as Turlington had envisioned, and because Harvey was attracting factory workers, which back in the day had working conditions comparable to a war zone, the residents voted to license saloons as early as 1895, so the days of Harvey being a temperance town didn't last very long. Briefly though, back then it was starting to look like it would be exactly as advertised for generations to come. Within a year, 1,800 of the 4,000 residential lots were sold to homeowners on the west side of the tracks. East of the tracks, where we are right now, manufacturers like J. Matthews Steel, the Western Steel and Spring Company, a power plant, the Craver and Steel Manufacturing Company, Harvey Steel Car Works, the Middleton Car Springs Company, and the Bel Air Stamping Company were drawn into setting up shop in Harvey. Now, while all of this development was occurring, Turlington Harvey continued to reside in Chicago, where he had other businesses. The community of Harvey was just an investment for him. But Turlington Harvey was not the only Harvey that this community is named after. There is another businessman in the area named Harvey Hopkins who helped develop the community of South Lawn after opening his business, Hopkins Motor Works, back in 1880, which was about 10 years before Turlington came into the picture. That being said, a postmaster for the area at the time chose the name of Harvey for the post office because he wanted to honor both Turlington Harvey and Harvey Hopkins. In May of 1891, the village of Harvey was officially incorporated. By 1900, Harvey was home to 5,300 people and as many as 11 large industries. At this point, things were going quite well. By the time of 1920, Harvey had a hospital and what was considered to be a great public school system. The downtown area was live and well as it was full of small shops and businesses. The schools were good, the neighborhoods were good, the jobs were good, the quality of life was overall pretty good. Good all around, good. The residential makeup was mostly made up of blue-collar European immigrants, mostly Polish, Irish, and Italians. There was also a sizable amount of white-collar workers who lived in Harvey, as the homes here were cheaper. They would just commute to downtown Chicago via train. Despite the population of Harvey not peaking until way later, it was around this time in the 1920s that the city's quality of life had peaked. On to the 1930s now, as just like most other places in America, the city had a tough go of it during the Great Depression. But just like most other places in America, Harvey was able to see an economic rebound in the 1940s, just after World War II. And by 1960, Harvey was home to 30,000 people. Now, here's when things started to turn for the worse, as during the period of 1960 to 1980, white families started to bolt from town for newer and fancier suburbs that were further away, and they took their money with them. During this 20-year period, the black population went from being 7% to 66%, so the population of Harvey was still growing overall, but it was becoming a poverty-stricken community, whereas before it was a middle-class community. Now, many of these black families came to Harvey from the south side of Chicago and worked in the factories that helped Harvey grow into what it was. Basically, the black families from the south side of Chicago were seeking that better quality of life that supposedly was going to be found in Harvey. Well, what ended up happening was these factories ended up shutting down during the same time frame, and since there was no diversity to the economy, there was no other type of work to be found in the community, and things began to fall apart fast. Because so many of these black families were experiencing unemployment and poverty, It didn't take long for Harvey to become one of the more economically disadvantaged suburbs in all of Chicagoland. And by the way, no, I'm not being a
racist.
I'm just stating facts, because unfortunately black families from a generational standpoint have come from a poorer background, and the income that Harvey residents were bringing in dramatically shifted for the worse during this time. That means that Harvey collected fewer tax dollars as the property values and household income numbers saw a huge decline. Hope that makes sense. Well, also during this time, unfortunately, Harvey saw a significant increase in crime. Racial tensions in town grew substantially too, which led to race riots throughout the 60s. Now, throughout the 1950s and 60s, there were dozens of well-documented race riots that occurred throughout Chicagoland, but in Harvey, there's one in particular that stands out. In 1964, a riot began when a black woman attempted to steal a bottle of gin from Foremost Liquor in neighboring Dixmoor. Sometimes this event is referred to as the Gin Bottle Riot. The liquor store owner noticed the woman trying to steal the gin and then got her to the ground and started throwing punches. Black residents outside noticed and then responded in anger by stealing more liquor from the store and burning several buildings in the vicinity. The liquor store was on the north side of 147th Street, which serves as the boundary between Dixmoor and Harvey, so Harvey was affected by this too, even though the liquor store was technically in Dixmoor. Well, during the gin bottle riot, the rioters were out of control as they threw stuff at cars that were passing by, and over 1,000 people took part in these riots. It resulted in destruction of the neighborhood, severe injuries to about 30 people or so, and about 25 arrests. Plus, the neighborhood was destroyed. And after the riots, this is what the Foremost Liquor storefront looked like. We'll get back to some racial tensions that occurred here from the 60s to the 90s later in the video, as there's more to mention there, but first, I want to show you downtown Harvey and talk a little bit more about what things used to be like compared to what things are like today. Along the way, we'll see a fair share of abandoned buildings along Park Avenue. Notice the vehicle I'm driving next to says, Thornton Township Tiffany A. Henyard Supervisor. Yeah, that's reached its expiration date just about, as Henyard is also the mayor of the neighboring suburb of Dalton, and for a video on Dalton and to see everything that Tiffany Henyard has been up to, you can check out this link here. Alright, well, this is downtown Harvey. The best thing about it is the train station connecting it with downtown Chicago. Otherwise, there's not much going on in downtown Harvey these days. Not much of a reason for anyone to want to come visit either, as pretty much every storefront is closed. So, once again, briefly, earlier I was talking about how the plans called for the industrial part of town to be east of the tracks, while the residential part of Harvey was west of the tracks. So here we are, west of the tracks. Harvey was also described as being a thriving place in the 1920s with open shops all along the downtown streets and people living their lives like any other well-functioning city from back in the day. Safe to say that it's hard to see Harvey as ever being a well-functioning city when looking at it today. Up ahead is 154th and Broadway, which is the main cross streets for historic downtown Harvey. The building that you can see on the left side of the intersection can be seen in this photo here. Back then, Broadway Avenue used to be called Columbia Avenue.
Here's what that shot looks like from the same angle 132 years later. I'm standing in front of what the 1892 catalog once called the French block of Harvey, and today it's not much of anything.
The French block stretched along Columbia Avenue from 154th to 153rd, and it included the noticeable building that we were looking at earlier at the corner of the main cross streets. You can even see the word French engraved on that building in the 1892 catalog photo. Well, back to the racial tensions and gang activity from the 1960s to the 90s, that alone could be a huge reason as for why Harvey looks the way that it does today. So I talked about the gin bottle riot from 1964. Well, after that, time went on and racial tensions continued throughout the 60s. Street gangs started to move to Harvey from Chicago as well. Not only did gangs such as the Blackstone Rangers cause violence with innocent people in the community, but they also caused violence by battling with rival gangs, such as the Black Disciples. The Black P. Stones were quite active in Harvey as well in the later part of the 1960s. Gang activity was active in the neighboring community of Phoenix to the east as well, which I'll show you that community in my second video on Harvey, which will be linked down below once that's uploaded. In that video, I'll show you all of the footage that I filmed but didn't use in this video, so at the end of this, if you want to see what more of Harvey looks like, make sure to check out that video. Back to the story, as in 1968, Blackstone Ranger member Roger Bowman threatened Harvey's police, as he claimed to have been treated unfairly by Harvey's police. He and other gang members were upset over a black teenager that had been shot and killed by the cops. This led to a string of events, the first one being a gathering at McKinley Elementary School in April of that year. That school is now called Rosa Parks Elementary. The gang members lit a bonfire at the school and started throwing rocks at police officers and anyone else who had passed by. Some even fired their guns. Nobody died during this violent protest, but newspaper articles say that a woman was shot through the walls of her home and other people were injured that day as well. The violence continued throughout the year, as in August, the Black P. Stones went after Harvey police again in response to another police shooting in the south side of Chicago. A year later in 1969, there was violence now among the students at Thornton Township High School. This was a result of racial tensions building throughout the late 60s, and at this time the school had plenty of gang members who had a dislike towards white people, and the school also had plenty of white people who had a dislike towards black people, as this is what life was like in many urban neighborhoods throughout the U.S. back then. School ended up being closed for more than a few days in response to the fights that would often break out among the students. Oftentimes, the fights would turn into brawls. Vandalism occurred too at the school, as over 20 windows were broken in one day. In 1970, race wars started to slowly transition into gang wars. There were reportedly 25 gang-related shootings by the Black P. Stones in Harvey's city limits, in which most of them were targeted against rival gang members. By 1978, most whites had moved out of Harvey. Black families that didn't want to be involved in gang activity started to move out of town too. That's if they had the means to. Keep in mind that while gang activity had a strong presence in Harvey, it was only a tiny percentage of the population that was involved in such activity. Before we move on with the timeline, another thing to mention about Harvey during the 60s would be the infamous Dixie Square Mall. It was a big deal when it opened, just like all shopping malls were during this time, but the difference with the Dixie Square Mall is that it closed in 1978. Most suburban shopping malls lasted much longer than this one did. The Dixie Square Mall closed in the 70s due to a lack of business and a rise in crime. It said that drug addicts would often be hanging out at the mall too. The amazing part of this is that the mall stood abandoned all the way until 2012, a time span of 34 years. Here's a Google Street View shot of the mall from Dixie Highway in May of 2011. Now let's get the heck out of here and get back to where we were. However, there is a lot of abandonment and empty stretches of streets in the vicinity of the old mall, and once again you can see some of that in my second video, linked down below. Well, throughout the 1980s, gang membership continued to grow as things were becoming much worse. Gang activity started to have a presence in pretty much every corner of the suburb at this point, all while the factories in town continued to close up shop. Residents of all ethnicities continued to move out of Harvey at a faster rate than ever before. Lower-income residents continued to make up a larger percentage of the population. By the mid-80s, it said that 1 out of every 3 Harvey residents were living in poverty. Gang activity continues to be a problem in Harvey today. However, it saw its peak during the 90s, and since then, it has settled down quite a bit. Things today are not near as bad as they were in the 90s. We're just seeing the results of the 2-decade stretch of the 80s and 90s when things were outrageous here. The results, of course, being the abandonment everywhere you look. Well, besides the gang activity and the decline of the industry that's hurt this town, there's more to blame for Harvey's decline. That being, the local leadership. Corruption has played a huge factor over the years in how things have gone here. In 1985, the FBI investigated Harvey's police department for staging fake drug raids in the nearby suburbs of Phoenix and Dixmoor. The FBI found that Harvey police were actually stealing drugs and drug money from rival gangs in those other suburbs. During this time, Harvey's mayor David Johnson had tensions with the police chief. Johnson blamed the police publicly for all of the problems that Harvey was facing at the time, but Johnson didn't have clean hands himself, as he paid certain employees substantial amounts of money for their salaries, so much so that it didn't seem right. We're running out of time for this video, so I can't mention every corruption case, but trust me, you could talk for an hour about the corruption that Harvey has faced in the last 50 years. But I'll fast forward to some of the more recent cases of corruption, as in 2019, 6 were charged as a part of a federal investigation. During this FBI raid, feds discovered that Harvey police knew about a prostitution ring that was going on inside of a Harvey strip club, and they did nothing about it, as long as the strip club continued to make payments to 2 different officers. One of the police officers that was accepting payments was the brother of former Harvey Mayor Eric Kellogg, who left office in the spring of 2019. 2 other police officers were found to have been falsifying police reports to protect some of their friends from receiving firearms charges, as the 2 friends were convicted felons who couldn't legally possess a firearm. Additionally, there were 2 other Harvey police officers who accepted bribes from the owner of a towing company. Additionally, a woman named Olivia Cobbins was hired in 2021 to try to stop the police corruption in Harvey, but she left the job after only a few months and said that she was disgusted by what she saw. Cobbins told Chicago CBS 2, "I couldn't stand in the position that I was in as a woman and as a police officer and see the level of corruption and misconduct in Harvey." She went on to say how police blocked her from investigating another police officer for punching a handcuffed student at Thornton Township High School. So basically, she was hired to do a job, but fellow police officers stopped her from being able to do her job. Yeah, understandable why she left, I would say. Speaking of police officers punching handcuffed students at Thornton Township High School, that's where we are right now. Thornton Township High School is home to the Wildcats. There's quite a few notable alumni, including actor Michael Boatman, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame group, the Dells, who amazingly started singing together at performances while attending high school here, and that's pretty neat. There's also actress Suzanne Douglas. She's an alumni. She's no longer with us, rest in peace. So is Grammy Award winner Lupe Fiasco, actor LaRoyce Hawkins, and lastly, one of my favorite NFL players from being a Steelers fan growing up, Antoine Randall, is an alumni of Thornton Township High School. Man, that was an impressive list of alumni at Thornton Township High School. And there was many more that I didn't mention just because it would have been too long of a list, but you could put together a starting lineup for a basketball team, you could put together several music groups, you could put together an entire sitcom based off of people that graduated from here. Seriously, it's quite impressive. Well, anyway, people, it is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that you can't always trust a Harvey police officer and you can't always trust their successors, but you can always trust Chris's livability score. The first category is education. And despite the impressive list of actors, music artists, and athletes, the overall academic performance of the school comes in pretty low on the list. U.S. News ranks college readiness as a 7.1 out of 100. Yeah, you can only be 7 full points lower than that. 1 out of every 4 students ends up not gaining their high school diploma. And unfortunately, it's one of the worst schools in all of Chicagoland. Education gets a 3 out of 20. Next up is crime, and while it's not as bad today as it was in the peak years of the 90s, it can still be pretty dangerous up in this hood. Crime gets a 4 out of 20. Downtown is next, and the liveliness of downtown Harvey is equivalent to that of a landfill. The only active place is the train station, or the way out of town. Downtown gets a 1 out of 20. 1 for the few historic buildings that still remain with the potential to be saved. Economy is next, and if it weren't for being in Chicagoland where you can still find greater economic opportunities in other nearby communities, it would be less than what I'm giving it, which is a 4 out of 20. The fifth category is recreational opportunities, which are far and few in between. Usually I'll tack on a point if there's a recreational trail along an old railroad grade or if there's a sizable park in the city limits, but there are none of those. The best thing Harvey residents have would be Kickapoo Meadows just north of the city limits, and honestly, there's other Cook County parks a little bit further away with better nature trails. Recreation gets a 3 out of 20. History is the best scoring category for Harvey in the Chris livability score. To nobody's surprise, the town has a rich history with the steel and car making industries, and for several decades, Harvey was nice enough to build what used to be a pretty nice downtown area, but that didn't last long. For a south suburb of Chicago, Harvey has very interesting history, and it's history that might help revive it one day if it ever sees a comeback. It gets a 15 out of 20. Amenities is next, and if it weren't for the shopping area that we saw at the very beginning of this video, it would get an even lower score than what I'm about to give it, which is a 3 out of 20. It's sad, but the truth is that there's not much offered in Harvey. The last category is cost of living, which the prices of homes are dirt cheap, but you still have to pay Illinois taxes. If you're a resident of Harvey, you can't always trust that your tax dollars are in good hands with the local leadership, so cost of living gets a 15 out of 20. All in all, the Chris livability score for Harvey, Illinois is 48 out of 160, putting it in second to last place out of all of the cities that I've done this for so far. Look, there's not much of a reason why anyone should want to live in Harvey these days. There are way too many other good options when choosing a place to live. Well, in my second video on Harvey, you can see more of what this place looks like, along with the neighboring community of Phoenix, and I left out a lot of abandoned stretches of streets in this video, so you can see a lot of it in that one. So make sure to check out that second video, and once it's uploaded, the link will be down below. Additionally, if you want to see a video on another Chicago suburb that I feel like is very similar to Harvey, make sure to check out this video here. Peace.